update.
Right, so could we invite the work group co-chairs to the front?
And this will be a little informal. I mean, not slides, but just a summary of the discussion topics that came up and some of the issues and then the plan for today, just to give you a sense. But we do hope that people stick with the same work group because I think we're going to have, obviously going to go more in depth and build upon the connections that we made yesterday. So we will start with technical infrastructure.
Hi.
Hang on one second.
I have to wait.
Chris. Yeah, I just want to repeat the announcement I made before, that if you left your luggage in the back of the room, the powers that be have determined that to be a fire hazard, and all luggage has been moved to room H, where it is safe and sound. So if you go to the back of the room and don't see your bags, that room H is where they are. Sorry, Chris.
Hi. So the Technical Infrastructure Working Group had a great meeting yesterday. We started off with a recap of everything we've done so far on our last year and on our teleconferences. We went around the room and introduced each other. You probably don't care about that part. But at any rate, we spent the majority of the time in 3 breakout groups. We had originally planned 4, but one of them didn't get any takers, so we went with 3. The 3 breakout groups analyzed and discussed the framework components of technical infrastructure in a concrete way, the actual things that make up technical infrastructure and how they work together and what we might be able to do to influence their development in the future. We had another group that worked on conceptual elements of the technical infrastructure framework. So they took the 30,000-foot level, the view of what are we trying to get done and what is the purpose of infrastructure, so sort of an abstracted layer. And then we finally had a third group that focused on topics related to other organizations and groups, the people not in the room, and the organizations and institutions that we might want to engage with in order to actually affect change. Because as we all know, there's only a small number of people here compared to the population out in the world. And we wanted to talk about where we might engage with the developer community, whether that's open source developers, commercial developers, associations, organizations like NIH, funding agencies, and so forth. And the 3 groups had a really good time talking to each other. We had originally planned to spend the last 30 minutes of the session on a report out, but everybody was so engaged in their conversations that we just kept going. And we had a very brief report out at the end. We focused on the question for today, which is going to be what is it that we as an organization, MCBK and the people in the room can actually do in the next month, quarter, 6 months, year, and what are achievable goals and what is scopable within the amount of energy and attention that we all who have full-time jobs elsewhere can give to this project over the next year. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to spend a lot of today talking about what is it, what's our action plan for the next year, what are we going to do, and also identifying, and I probably shouldn't say this because maybe it'll scare some people away from the room, but identifying people who are willing to put their hand up and say, yes, I'll take the lead on that, or yes, I'll be involved in that project, and really try to get some traction on getting some things done. We're going to begin the session today with 3 presentations from some of our poster presenters that we think exemplify technical infrastructure at different levels, from the very granular, I'm trying to solve this specific problem, to the big picture, I'm trying to design a system. And so we'll have 3 presentations, and then we will have discussions about an action plan. I don't know if you want to add to that?
I was just going to add that. So perfect. Right. So come and join us again.
Right.
So good morning. I'm Jerry Perry and co-chair of the Sustainability and Inclusion Work Group. Special thanks to Chris Dimmick, who is going to miss today's session, isn't able to be here, and to Josh Rubin for taking notes during our session yesterday. Today, Doug Van Houweling will co-chair with me our efforts when we meet. So similarly, as Chris reported, we reviewed our charter, the work that we're doing, and some SMART goals that we've developed over the last year, and our progress to date, and after having done introductions. The goal for our session really was around developing a tactical plan to create a communication strategy for outreach to some professional societies. And prior to gathering, we had conducted a poll, and through that process, we identified 4 priority organizations with which to work: American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and then AMIA. And then today, our conversation is going to focus on AUSL, the Association of Academic Health Sciences Libraries, and then HIMSS. So we did this working from a series of structured questions. However, pretty quickly in our session, we reframed our question, largely because we had framed it originally to focus on society memberships. And in fact, what we really wanted to do was talk more about the society as an entity or an organization. So some of the things that we learned in the conversation were that in terms of messaging and benefit, in terms of working with these professional societies, anything we can do to relieve members of their EHR burden would be welcome. That was our first soundbite. Folks want to see patients without spending 24 hours a day to do so. We should focus on societies as orgs, not the individual members. And there's opportunity to leverage working with leadership and boards, and also to work through the staffs of these societies. We need to align with tasks that members have to do in terms of regulatory bodies and commitments. If we can help in some way to make that easier, that would be greatly appreciated. Align with business incentives, and then another soundbite: bring joy back to practice. That was kind of nice. So some other key points that we heard in the summarization that we conducted was that we, of course, need to work at the leadership level. We need to focus our message. Their members, the members of these professional societies, want to help, and so we need to be providing opportunities for them to do so. We need to distinguish what about MCBK is different from what other organizations deliver, and then leverage that, of course. What value does MCBK bring to the society itself specifically? What has been successful for that society upon which MCBK can leverage or extend or in some capacity enhance? Societies also have their own governance structures. Are there ways that we can appropriately leverage those? For instance, working groups that exist within an association such as AMIA. And among the societies, which are those that are more mature in terms of the spectrum around where they're at with health information technology, and those that are more mature ought to be the area of focus for us. And then we ought to be convening with those societies or with their subgroups. We need to find common ways of expressing the value proposition, and we need to identify those societies to prioritize. For today, we're going to have a similar focus, but working with AUSL and then the Healthcare Information and Management Systems Society, HIMSS. We're going to work from the same set of questions, but I think today's session will cut it a little bit shorter so that we can start focusing on a template that we've developed, which is a framework for what a communication strategy might look like. We want to start populating it with some brief notes, and then as Chris was sort of noting, we're hoping that people will step forward, raise their hand, and volunteer to work to carry it forward. So, thank you.
I'm Bob Greenis, and Bruce Bray is my co-chair. We had a very lively discussion in the standards work group with probably 30, 35 people attending, so it was well attended. And we spent the initial part going over what we called 2 use cases, one in the clinical domain with multiple episodes of care, and the other in the genomic research domain with translation of basically assertions from that to the clinical process. And we had a lot of discussion about whether these were really use cases or not, scenarios, user stories. We had some people that would volunteer to make them more formal. But I think, however that turns out and whether that goes forward, the main purpose of it is not to create use cases as a product, but rather to use them as kind of a springboard for exploring a framework for the kinds of knowledge that we need to use in those settings, and what kinds of groups we need to interact with that are producing those, and related issues to that. So we kind of launched into that second part, and we're going to cover more of that today in terms of the stakeholders, it appears that there's quite a bit of difference in the kinds of levels that we could be involved in or should be involved in the clinical space, which was actually by far the majority of the attendees, but also highly populated with active groups that are involved in various levels of interoperability, from standards to demonstrations and sandboxes and ways to build implementation libraries and so on. So we have a much more mature, in a way, but also somewhat disorganized set of stakeholders that the role of MCBK needs to be looked at in terms of how it relates to those, and we'll spend some time today on that. The other thing that occurred to me was another topic was kind of the life cycle of knowledge artifacts and what role in knowledge management. And actually, I don't know if we'll have a chance to present that, but I shared with Alan Flynn, who was our superb kind of facilitator and note-taker and presenter, 3 interlocking life cycles that I actually have in a book that I put together on the knowledge acquisition process, the knowledge curation process, and the knowledge use process, all of which have life cycles that interact with each other. So we might want to think about something like that. The other thing that we want to explore further is that as we look at clinical settings or research settings or any other kind of setting where knowledge is needed, there's usually kind of a process that's going on. It's not just a moment in time. So whether it's represented by a workflow or state transition model or some other kind of model, it might be helpful for us to create some representative frameworks or patterns of interaction and flow. And so I was talking with Peter Haug, and maybe he can enlighten us this afternoon. Are we meeting in the afternoon? I guess, yeah. Not this morning, I guess. The morning's pretty full. About ways that we might be able to use BPMN, for example, as the way to capture state transition models or other ways. What we're thinking is that the nodes on those could be basically the point at which meta tags and basically other kinds of ways to retrieve relevant knowledge resources can be attached. And so this might be a way to think about how to organize what our contribution could be. Anyway, we'll discuss more of that, and also the stakeholder community that we need to relate to this afternoon. And Bruce, do you want to add anything?
No, I think other than it's interesting when you get a more diverse group, which I think the MCBK group is, not just modelers and standard developers, but implementers, producers, consumers of the knowledge. Getting the group together like that really expands the model. And we, in HL7, we focused a lot on developing knowledge. Developing information, terminology, messaging standards. The knowledge representation standards are less mature, which is, I guess, one of the things we're focusing on. But then, in how to communicate this well, and how to harmonize with the other work groups for building. Basically, we're not talking about building new standards in this group, but identifying gaps, identifying barriers, and to actual implementation of these sort of things. So I think a larger, more diverse group is very helpful for shining the better light on that whole problem.
All right, and the Trust and Policy Working Group met also yesterday. I co-chair this with Blackford Middleton, who's also here. And we did a fairly didactic session yesterday, but we reviewed what we mean by knowledge commons. We also developed and talked a lot about the framework, the L1 to L4 framework for the development of knowledge objects and knowledge artifacts, so that we understand what it is that we're developing policy and governance around. We heard from Alan Lichter about his experience in developing CancerLink and setting up that as more of a data commons, but as an example of an organization that needs governance and needs business models and ways of sustaining itself and building itself so that the type of knowledge commons that we're talking about can also thrive and be successful. Today, and we also reviewed the work that the working group has done up until now, which is to begin to understand what are the existing knowledge commons out there, what are their governance systems, what are their cultures, what are their approaches to creating knowledge objects, what types of objects do they develop? Are they L1 artifacts, are they L4 artifacts, are they private entities, public entities, et cetera? So we reviewed a lot of that work. We had a little bit of discussion about it, and today we're really hopefully going to do a deep dive into what the principles emerging from knowledge commons are, where the gaps and opportunities for policy and governance are and should be, and thinking about not only the principles of findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, but also of fairness and other principles that may go beyond those four. So we'll hear today from John Fox about Open Clinical and some of his experience with governance and policy and trust, and do a little bit of review from last time, but mostly what we're going to be doing is identifying these principles and properties of policy needs for MCBK and other groups like it. That's it. Thank you.
So thanks to all the co-chairs. We look forward to continued interesting discussions and forward progress in the work group meetings that will take place later this afternoon. So before I introduce Dr. Rucker, I want to introduce an asynchronous interactive exercise in which we hope you will all participate. Don, you have your mobile with you? You're invited as well. If you go to menti.com and use code 746133, you don't have to do this now, by the way. In fact, you may want to wait a while because we won't be looking at the input from the group in this exercise till around noon. So we're going to give everybody a chance as the morning unfolds and their thinking matures, and as the caffeine takes hold, or whatever else you use to wake yourself up in the morning, to actually review these results. You will be asked a couple of questions about MCBK and the meeting, and your responses will help shape the further planning of MCBK going forward from this meeting, and they will also be used to shape the reflective comments that we will hear from three panelists, Leslie McIntosh, Doug Van Houweling, and Peter Emby, in the closing session of the meeting. So you have on your chair, if someone hasn't taken it, a handy-dandy written reminder of what to do after this slide disappears. So please take this with you. You may not want to do this now, but we hope you will do this before noon, and we'll remind you again in case you're like me and don't remember what, as my wife tells me, what I was told an hour ago. So this is here for you, and we really would like your input and response to the questions via the app. Did I leave anything out? Okay. So it's truly a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Don Rucker, who, according to my finger count, is the 6th national coordinator? 7th. Okay. You'll have to tell me later who I left out. But you know, looking back from the perspective of my 4 years at the ONC, it's been remarkable to observe how each of the national coordinators has brought unique strengths as a consequence of their personal characteristics and their background and experience. I had the pleasure of working for Rob Kolodner, who was number 2, who had deep government health IT experience, and then for David Blumenthal, who was number 3, who had very, very deep policy experience. And then later, Karen DeSalvo came with very, very deep public health experience. And each national coordinator has really contributed from the vantage point and perspective offered by their unique experiences. So when I saw that Dr. Rucker had been selected as the next national coordinator, I did ignore the fact that he had some relationship with Ohio State, of which he frequently reminds me. But and I went, yes, this is terrific. Dr. Rucker brings a combination of formal training in informatics, obviously his medical background, his medical training as an emergency physician, years of experience in the health IT vendor community, and it's a marvelous combination and really unique in the succession of national coordinators. And I think, having listened to him present on many occasions, this fusion of backgrounds and experiences that he brings is enormously powerful and will be enormously beneficial to the National Health IT program going forward. So we're particularly delighted to have him here today. Let me welcome Dr. Rucker to the podium.
All right. Well, thanks, Chuck, for that nice introduction, and we won't mention anything about the school up north, as they say in Columbus, Ohio. First of all, it's great to be here. I have, there's many of my long-term colleagues since, even grad school days in Ted Shortlift's group who are here, so it's a delight. I think the field that many of us have been in, for a long time, I think it is really sort of coming to the fruition these days. Arguably, it took maybe a couple decades longer to do that than maybe some of us thought. So that part is interesting to reflect on well. But I think when you look at the policy that gets the surround of computable biomedical knowledge, that's the part that I can talk about today. I think there are two big policy, there are two big sort of forces that are driving all of this, and it's worth just thinking about the forces. One is absolutely obvious, which is just the growth of computing, right? If you reflect back to the early days of AI, we had pretty much the same algorithms we do today when you get right down to it. Neural nets, statistical approaches. We didn't have the data and we didn't have the computing power. And so now we actually have not just the algorithms, but we actually have the computing power and the raw data to deal with it. That will have, I think, all kinds of implications to talk about in a second here. Obviously, I think we're just on the first part of a world of Internet of Things that is going to fundamentally drive the healthcare system and think about what the computable elements are. I don't need to talk to this audience about AI. In the consumer economic world, clearly smartphones are dominant, whether it's Menti or any number of other things. So I think we have to, sort of move our sort of mental mindset a bit from the desktop that we've been using for the last 20 odd years, the internet-based desktop to the smartphone. The other big revolution that's out there besides the computer revolution that will drive a lot of this is the economic revolution in healthcare. It's no secret that American healthcare is deeply broken. Our sort of cost-plus model where the government and payers are pretty much for a variety of incentives paying for anything under the sun that is then sucked out of the rest of the American economy, and then sucked into increasingly oligopolistic delivery systems. That game at some point is coming to an end. And when you look at the political dialogue, pick your party, pick your candidate, I think they all have various solutions to this. Your guess is what's going to happen is obviously, we have an election coming up, so who knows what is going to happen there. But I think the economic wins are going to transform healthcare. It is hard to imagine that transformation won't actually use computing and modern computing and automation. One area that we think is going to be transformative, there's a lot of activity both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch, is on information around price, right? We've essentially not had pricing information in American healthcare other than a couple non-regulated edge cases like LASIK surgery, plastic surgery, reflexology. I don't think that's an actual, well, at any rate, I'm not going to talk about that. Other than the edge cases, we've not really had markets and prices, but there's a lot of impetus to do that. You've heard about some of the noise around drug pricing. You may be aware that the president signed an executive order about, I think, 3 weeks ago, now with price transparency. Health and Human Services is charged in that executive order with doing rulemaking around pricing. Congress has a number of proposals around something called surprise billing. So I think you're going to see all kinds of things there. Now, what's interesting to think about is most of those things don't actually have any computable standards, right? So we'll talk about that in a second, but as you think about maybe the more grander computable part, and sort of implicit in the FAIR thing that has been written about and talked about, don't forget, we do not actually have a computational standard to have price communicated computationally. Isn't that amazing that American healthcare, where we have HL7 and LOINC and, standard after standard, X12, even the X12 financial standards are all about claims and remittances. There's no computable knowledge representation about price. Now, I'm not expecting MCBK to do that, but it's certainly worth thinking about. Now, Congress has been very active here, and the big law that was passed in 2016 was the Cures Act. The Cures Act had two big goals. One was empowering the public to get their information, and the other was around interoperability. Now, the Cures Act also had a whole bunch more stuff on the FDA. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to just limit to the IT. The provisions in there that to be thinking about as you think about the computable surround in medicine, the first provision is Congress passed a law preventing information blocking. So information blocking is the concept that folks don't want to share the information that has essentially been paid for in many ways, large and small, in healthcare by the public, that is sort of kept locked in the delivery systems. So that is now, as we speak, illegal. We were charged, we at ONC, Office of National Coordinator, were charged with putting exceptions around information blocking. So, we have some exceptions around, obviously, security, privacy, what's allowable. We have some language on reasonable costs for the application programming interfaces. The API charges, we've heard lots of complaints, have been massive and essentially have de facto prevented information sharing. So there's some language around that. We got 2,000 comments on our proposed rule. We're going through the comments and the final review cycle. We anticipate having a final rule there towards the end of the year. There's a companion rule from CMS on interoperability out there as well. The next area that, besides information blocking, is the Trusted Exchange Framework Common Agreement. We are going to be awarding somebody to do what's called the Common Agreement, which is basically getting the various health information exchanges to talk to each other. There was a lot of complaints on Capitol Hill that the various HIEs don't talk to each other, that, physicians, providers are charged for multiple of these. And clearly there's an opportunity for networking there. They exist in many parts of the country, not all. There's some commercial, there are 2 commercial HIEs. That, I would say, is a work in progress, how all of that will come together. But we're charged with putting the Trust Exchange framework and the Common Agreement together with a recognized coordinating entity. So that is in progress. The final thing, which I think is going to be by far the most transformative, is Congress's language in cures on what they call application programming interfaces without special effort. So ONC and CMS actually had APIs, open APIs, in the first edition of the 2015 EHR certification program. The problem was they were vendor specific. So, they were open, but they weren't really, I think, necessarily pro-public in the sense that we want standards-based API, so there isn't even further vendor lock-in, and that there can be a competitive market in the healthcare software space as well, at least to some extent, and that new entrants can at least challenge some of the incumbents there. So when you think about what a API without special effort is in 2019, pretty clearly that's RESTful, JSON, FHIR type of API. That's what drives the app economy. That's where open source tools are. So that's really pretty much where we see that world going. So we're working a lot with HL7, with the FHIR group, with Graham Grieve, with Ken Mandel, Boston Children's, a number of people on doing that. These types of APIs have been absolutely transformative in many other parts of our economy. You think of anything with communications, you think of anything with entertainment, you think of anything with travel, you think of anything with banking, right? These APIs have absolutely transformed, just think of Uber and Lyft, right? So we had with Uber and Lyft, we had a lot of these local taxi cab organizations that were a lot of sort of heavy regulatory burden, sometimes in places like Philadelphia, where I lived for a long time, bordering on outright corruption, if not outright corruption. And all of a sudden, with lots of work, I might say, but with many APIs, the Ubers and Lyfts sort of broke through that. There's an interesting potential for that in healthcare. And then it's worth thinking about, what do you in fact need? What is the knowledge that you need to do that? There are a couple things that I want to point out here that are sort of going on a little bit behind the scenes. The first is the original concept of these APIs, using sort of the RESTful APIs, using FHIR, were all N of one. They're single individual queries, right? So the use case, we heard earlier about use cases, but that use case was predicated really on get me my data, or, maybe arguably, clinician A to clinician B type of thing. We're working with pretty much all of the large payers on a population level data standard. So, a bulk population standard, right? The stuff that, in fact, queries were built for, right? If you go back to SQL or any of the other query languages. And because we want to be able to use this modern computing around a population, it's worth noting that right now, there's essentially no provider accountability computationally in the US. The provider accountability today is on these very narrow quality, highly curated and frankly highly gamed quality measures, right? So they've taken a very narrow view of what clinicians do. And every specialty society, of course, lobbies that their measures are, easy to hit and, not that hard. It's okay if the other specialty have really hard things to do, but, for our specialty, So it has not worked out. That search for value through quality measures has not worked out. And if you want to get a broader set of data, right, big data, for example, on providers, you all have to go through custom interfaces. I worked at a relatively small worksite clinic provider for a while, and at that operation, we had for 400 sites to do about 190 custom queries a month, for, measurement by various and sundry payers. The payers will complain they're often charged $5 an electronic download for a single chart, right? So if they can't actually get any data to analyze the payer supervision of providers, that should be a way of checking the rise in healthcare costs and who ultimately represent us as citizens, have no computable power. So in working with the Da Vinci Group and working on these population level queries, we hope for the first time ever to actually provide interfaces. Now, that data will need to be shared under the terms of HIPAA, right? So there's a signed contract. This is not on demand. This is not like the cures where the patient can point their smartphone to and get their chart, download that on their smartphone. These are contractual arrangements, written contracts, part of the network arrangements. But it'll be, I think, a very interesting discussion with providers when you have, the big data type of approach to analyzing what providers are doing. So that will be, I think, quite revealing and a very different discussion than today's payer-provider discussion, which is mostly around how the providers have constructed their networks and their marketing. Now, when you look at that data, I think for this group, it poses the intellectual challenge, which you're better equipped to answer than I am, which is what is going to be the ultimate mix of structured knowledge and, just free text? How, what are going to be the knowledge artifacts, if you will, that are going to be most powerful here? That's, I think, your mission and your work is to actually sort that out. The ONC contribution, right? Where, as you might imagine, buffeted. On the one hand, people say we need more structured data and you should require it. And I'm thinking, structured data means that I, as a clinician, have to go and enter it, right? And who's going to pay me to do that, right? We just heard about burden, right? So that's, obviously, that type of stuff is a major fuel for burden. And then you talk with the Googles of the world, and they'll say, oh, don't bother your little brains with, structuring the data. Just give us the free text and we'll deal with it. Pretty clearly, there's some mix and match there of how this is all going to end up. That, I think, is what you're working on today to do. We're going to have time for questions, by the way, and comments. So just as you're listening to this, all of the data issues as we look today. I mean, even this week there was stuff on the Chrome and I think Mozilla browser and add-ins to those that were basically sending private data to third parties wholesale. We have a massive ongoing national discussion on security and privacy, and I think it's not even actually security fundamentally. I think we actually know how to do the cryptographic. I think we know how to do OAuth 2. Maybe when quantum computers come, that there'll be something different there. I think we know that part of it reasonably well. Not to say that it's easy. It's, of course, blisteringly hard. But the part that I think we haven't sorted out is what's the trade-off in privacy for all of this computing that we have now surrounded ourselves with, right? You come here, you use Waze, whatever you use, you use a credit card, right? there are more people who know about our lives and what we do, right? Anybody who's tracking GPS, right? Anybody who's tracking an accelerometer, right? So we have infinite amounts of, and a lot of that is very specific health information, right? If my GPS says I'm going to the HIV clinic or the mental health clinic or the liquor store or, McDonald's, right? Pick your vice every day. That is pretty informative as opposed to what my medical issues would be, maybe much more informative than my actual chart, where I may have, sort of hidden that or, forgot about it. So we have to, I think, you can play a huge role here in this national discussion of privacy and secondary uses of data. As you know today, in HIPAA is interesting. So most of our, just as a quick sort of get everybody in the same note, most of the app world uses something called end-user licensing agreements, which basically delineate what they're allowed to do with the data. And as we all know, because we want to use whatever we want to use the app for, we click through that. Do you agree, right? And if we didn't agree, like, what are we going to do about it, right? Pick your thing, right? There's seemingly no choice. HIPAA is a bit different. HIPAA, at least the HIPAA right authorization, HIPAA right access, we'll talk about in a second. Now, the HIPAA authorization, unless you get explicit additional consent, HIPAA allows providers, so covered entities and business associates, for treatment, payment, and operations to share data. So that is, your basic blanket sea of, allowed uses that you sit in. If you want anything else, that's explicit. I can assure you there's vast congressional interest in this, in the right of access. There are all kinds of people who are lobbying to, shut down patients' right of access. This is all done basically under the guise of protecting your privacy. We have vast entities in American healthcare who've built highly non-transparent business models. We have entities for whom their business model is the maintenance of non-transparency. Seemingly every one of them is on the Hill. So it's a very fluid state, but I think clearly we have to think about what are the allowable secondary uses of data. You may have seen, coming here this morning, I saw that, a bunch of senators are getting together to look at, privacy with the technology companies, the Facebook, Google discussion that is, heated up literally even in this week with fines and, in actions in Europe and here. So I think we have to think about that. I think we can think about privacy in, what are permitted uses? We don't have a great consent model, let's face it, on how do we inform the public about what their data is being used for. I think that is it's maybe not the most exciting thing in biomedical knowledge, but I think it is actually a great area that you can contribute to on that. So let me just finish here with a couple things for folks to sort of be on the lookout for as you think about stuff and do work here. Obviously, the ONC and CMS interoperability rules will be coming out. The rulemaking process in Washington, D.C. is Byzantine, is way more Byzantine, I think than getting a grant from NIH. It's more random. And it seems to me, I was never up to getting NIH grants, so kudos to all of you who were able to do that. But it certainly has its challenging aspects, but we hope to have these rules out towards the end of the year. So watch out for that. I think I would watch out and pay attention to the discussion around price transparency. That will drive market prices, transform economies. Efficiency in healthcare isn't going to come until we have market prices. If you remember back to college economics, price equals marginal cost equals marginal utility. That is not just an economic thing, it is the definition of efficient uses of resources. If we're going to have efficient uses of resources in healthcare, we have to have market prices, because market prices are not just an economic construct, they're an information theory. information science construct. Friedrich Hayek won the Nobel Prize in Economics 45 years ago for describing that. The other thing, obviously, to keep an eye on is all the stuff that's going on in Congress, on the Hill, in the White House. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of a sense of the informatics surround, at least as I perceive it, on how we go about our the jobs of knowledge, representation, of communication, how we get to sort of the FAIR principles, how we make these things, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think with that, we have time for questions. Chuck, is that sort of what we agreed to here? I think we have, 15 minutes or roughly time for questions? I don't know if anybody, there's mics. So if anybody wants to come up for questions or comments, anybody can come up except for Blackford Middleton. Oh, wait a minute. Oh.
Oh, no.
All right, Blackford and I were grad students together. This is my one chance to get even.
I interviewed with Don Rucker for my fellowship position at Stanford, and I got in anyway. Thank you for that, Don. Number one, thank you for your ongoing leadership and inspiration to all of us that we can actually see and point to progress in the field that is remarkable. So thank you for that. I have a two-part question. Sort of one deals with data and the economics, and the second with the economics of knowledge. I'm convinced that the marginal cost of acquiring one more piece of data goes down as you acquire more data. I'm equally convinced the marginal value of each additional piece of data goes up because it's now in a pool of a sea of data. So that, I think, is a compelling market force for us to think about data aggregation and reduce the information blocking in all the ways you've already described. The part that I'm not sure about yet, and I ask you to describe what policy levers you might see as options. If we think about the same equation for knowledge, if structuring the additional piece of knowledge cost goes down and the value of that additional piece of computable biomedical knowledge goes up, what are the market levers and or policy levers which can drive that process? The problem is I think MCBK is a little bit, out in the academic realm too much. We need to think really what's going on in the marketplace. And I'm impressed with what Secretary Hargan and Peter Pronovost will do in the Quality Summit to harmonize all measure specifications across the government. What's the lever you can pull in the government to harmonize knowledge representation?
Yeah, so for folks who don't know, as part of the presidential order, and I think just sort of a general sort of thinking about what should be done in things, and I alluded to it earlier, around quality measures, Eric Hargan, who's the Deputy Secretary of HHS, so the number 2 guy in that whole literally $1 trillion plus operation, has been charged and is working with Peter Pronovost, in early stages of thinking about how do we, sort of synchronize these quality measures and how do we rethink that. We've had a lot of discussions on that. I actually have a meeting later today with Eric and some of the internal team to figure out, what rules of the road might be there. There are 1,000 things I could say about that, and we could all be here for weeks. It's sort of hard to think about what the best things are. I'll throw a couple things out. I think one thing is it is going to move more from narrowly curated data to broader data that is, I think ultimately more computable. In terms of value to the structured data, in the computable biomedical knowledge, I think part of the challenge why we haven't had computable biomedical knowledge is because we've just used our EHRs for billing systems. I mean, that's sort of a broad brushstroke. I know, if, certain vendors were here, maybe all of them, they beat me up with a stick. They try to do that anyway, just FYI. But, the reality is that's not their fault. They do what, we've incented them to do because we haven't measured it. We've spent vast amounts of time on these, the level 4 and 5 CPT billing codes, and most places, the medical records are essentially unusable for any narrative function. I know, I see Peter Emby, we were colleagues at Ohio State. In Ohio State, which has a very, very well-run IT shop, even there, I mean, you couldn't find anything because it was all cluttered with billing knowledge and goofy stuff. So I think if we can change incentives to be more performance-based, and the bigger surround here, what we don't have in healthcare is automation on our computers. So I think once we start having more automation, then the knowledge that drives automation is going to be extraordinarily valuable. But if all we're computing at is billing, then any knowledge that would drive automation is not as valuable. That's at least my top-level answer. Let me go over there and then, yes.
Yeah, to continue the Stanford troika. Hi, Don. So I'm struck by Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism, which you seem to actually already spoken against, which I appreciate that it's not just data, it's behavioral data. And any behavioral data that Google doesn't get is lost revenue to Google and Facebook and all these guys. But I'm also struck by the stuff that they want to do, which is direct your behavior and monetize your behavior, is the same stuff we want to do in health. We want to...
Say that last sentence again.
The same stuff that they want to do, which is direct your purchasing behavior, your behavior, is the same thing we want to do in health. We want to use all our tools to help you adhere better to your plan. We want to surveil you. We want to know when we want your behavioral data also. How do you negotiate between the evil uses of your behavior and, to put it in borderline personality terms, the evil uses of behavior and the good uses of your behavior data?
Yeah, well, I think the part about the consumer economy ultimately is you have to decide to buy something, right? You don't have that choice in American healthcare today, effectively. I mean, you have it at the margins, you have it in the copay, but ultimately, pretty much all of the problems we have today is because through a series of laws dating back to World War II, the free market consumer behavior has been stripped from us. So the reason we have irrational stuff is because we're not in charge. If we were in charge, it would be by definition irrational. And to your, I know your philosophic interest, the way to handle the equity issues is actually probably separate, right? It's a little bit of the challenge between hiring public school teachers versus vouchers. That's a rough analogy. So I think equity ought to be uncoupled. There's obviously a strong argument for equity, the John Rawls theory of justice, summarized there by the grace of God, go I, that's not what he said. But, if you look at that book, you can sort of see, I mean, there's 1,000 other books on this, starting with probably, the Old and New Testament, but in every religious tome in every religion. So I think we have to get that consumer power back, and then, consumers can decide what their engagement is going to be, and it'll be an engagement, I think, on the consumer's terms, right? Am I more likely to change my behavior if it's a sort of an interactive thing where I have to reflect on it? Am I more likely to change my behavior because CMS put out a MIPS measure on it, right? I mean, that's ultimately the question. So I think having smartphones just empowers people to have this more personal, and if we can get the choice we have in consumption into healthcare, that'd be a great thing. So, over here. Sorry.
Hi, thank you. Your lecture was fascinating, and I'm just curious: is there any appetite for a government-sponsored open source EHR, EMR system that could essentially be the example of? I was kind of hoping the VA would do this, but then they decided to go with, one of the big commercial ops.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the experiment there was obviously sort of the VA system, and would that expand? My gut tells me, I don't know, there's no policy that the U.S. government's going to go into the building of EHR. I think that's extremely clear. So let me be clear on that. I think over time, if you look at sort of computing software commercially, right, so there's more of just a historic observation. We have, in great measure, moved to an open source world, right? I mean, the tools we use are largely open source. You saw, IBM advertising they purchased Red Hat. Right, so we're moving, for example, the English healthcare system spine, which is quite elegant, is used with Silicon Valley open source tools, just to give you an example of that. I think as the volume of data comes, we're going to be more and more having this, on the cloud, in various places, open source tools, GitHub, right? You can just look at the broad array of data analysis tools. And if we can rationalize some of the payment things, then the EHR, the commercial EHRs, may shrink a little bit more down to some of the transactional data stores, some of the transaction handling, sort of the, work business process automation type tools. And the things that are sitting more on the more analytics side may go away. If the APIs are opened up enough, then you may be able to mix and match some of these things at runtime. Obviously, that you can imagine the politics around that are huge, but yeah. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, really wonderful talk, and I just am curious to know more about your statement that there are no standards for payment or prices. And in my naive idea, just put a price field on the claim form, but obviously it's not going to be that simple. So I was wondering if you could say what that would look like and how we might get there.
Yeah. So one of the very interesting informatics things, just top level, is that right now in American healthcare, we have 3 streams of information that are essentially disconnected. We have, I'll start with the smallest one, which is quality measures, right? It's sort of out-of-process stuff. It goes to the payers. There are some registries, I think the cardiology registry, maybe some of them are more used than others. But ultimately, that information is sort of disconnected from the overall flow of information. It's a half year, a year and a half, after the fact. That's one stream. Then there's the whole sort of clinical stream, and that's the HL7 version 2, version 3, DICOM, LOINC, SNOMED, all the kind of things that we sort of know and love. And then there's the financial stream, right? So the payment stream, which is the X12, and there are a whole bunch of folks. I've talked with Bill Stead about this at some good length. So that's, the X12, the WEDI, the CAQH, obviously NCVHS. And that stream is, other than the eligibility check, is entirely retrospective, right? The X12 stream, for want of a better word. And what it communicates are these claims and payments, right? So just remember what that is. You go to the clinician, go to the hospital. There's a whole coding shop that generates codes, hundreds of employees at even a good-sized institution. Then it sort of goes typically to a claims clearinghouse that does things, and then it sort of goes out to the payers. So in the X12 standards, they're designed to do that. They do it well. What you, of course, noticed in that entire payment stream was nothing about the clinical care that was rendered other than a CPT code, right? Like, what's missing here, right? Would you ever buy anything commercially with that ill-defined a product or that narrowly defined a product? So you have a very narrow product. The price information, what adds challenge there is this the negotiated price? Which negotiated price? Is it a private negotiated price? Is it the charge master price? There are all kinds of prices floating around. So, at any rate, I don't know, Chuck, can you tell me when we're finished here? It could be like... Thanks.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the good news is we have a long line.
Okay.
People waiting to ask you questions. The bad news is we have about 7 minutes.
Okay, all right, good. So yeah, that means don't talk so long, Don. Thank you. All right, Peter.
Don, thank you. So actually want to build a little bit on that, and I was very intrigued also by your topic. As we're thinking about computable knowledge and what we can be doing. I think we came at this, and perhaps I'm speaking too much for everyone, but I think we came at this first thinking about this from the perspective of mobilizing the kinds of things we tend to think about first, clinical guidelines, and we've been working on that for obviously quite some time, more recent evidence and sort of bringing that to practice and the like. There's a lot of different components that the group is thinking about, but sort of a categorization of those kinds of knowledge objects is something that we're starting to tease out as well. So, phenotypic characteristics and being more accurate about who we're going to even apply the knowledge to and what does that mean as we get more information. Probably any given individual can fall into multiple categories, or knowledge objects around outcomes, around events, around the kinds of practice that exists and how that's connected to other kinds of things that we might call from non-traditional sources, increasingly from real-world sources. And as we think about the challenges of doing that in the real world, I wonder what your perspective is on, are there particular kinds of areas like that we maybe should prioritize as you're thinking about the kinds of things you're trying to tackle in your office?
I think one of the priorities that maybe not totally obvious to this group, but that, as you know, I've been very interested in, is the operational characteristics. So, working with Peter and Philip Payne back in the day, we did some work on looking at phone calls, right? And not, phone calls mapped out to cost centers, and build a graph network of all of that. And the goal there was really to think about one-off process. And so these phone calls, it turns out at Ohio State there were 130,000 a day, used up about 10% of the FTE time, and roughly half of them were under 60 seconds, so with a median duration of 27 seconds. So 27 seconds, you have a phone call where you're basically saying, hey, Peter, it's Don. Where's the lab? Where's the wheelchair? Is the bed ready, right? So we are doing a vast amount of hand communication of things that are almost by their nature, if we're correctly instrumented, Internet of Things, computable. So I think one of the opportunities for this group is to think about the boundary of clinical and operational things. I think you'll find it easier, right? I see Bob there with guideline development over the many, many, many decades, and it's that part of it, is hard. But I think the things that are at the boundary may be the biggest win. That would be my thought.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Don, good morning. Subha Madhavan, Georgetown University. Thank you for sharing your priorities for the ONC. Thinking about ethical and responsible use of data and artificial intelligence models that are driving clinical decision support systems, I get the let the market economy and open consumerism drive some of the policies, but we also know that the deep learning models, et cetera, are not readily accessible or understandable by the average consumer. So what are your thoughts on sort of transparency and openness so that we could avoid this black box approach to artificial intelligence models that drive CDS systems?
Yeah, that is obviously a major, I think, research area. I was actually reading a document on that a couple days ago on the interpretability of these models. As you know, there's a bunch of technologies that look at the monotonicity of the model in some sort of local space and decide if you can do linear approximations, right? And then do there are a bunch of technologies to look at the what you can explain off of essentially local constructs, where you look at if you will, the manifold of how the knowledge is partitioning. That's an important research area to do that. Certainly from a public policy, from a payment policy, it is, we're bound more to classic quality measures that are explainable until we solve that or until we come up with some other constructs. I think there are a number of doable constructs there. But you're absolutely right. It's a great area for research for this group. Over here, sir.
And we'll have to make this the last question. I'm terribly sorry.
Yep, sorry.
Thanks for your talk. I mean, that was very heartening, especially about the information blocking progress. And to that end, I think the biggest thing which I've been encountering is the aggregation of data and knowledge and tools and technologies together, when there should be like a defining line between that, like the tools and technology should be separate from the data and knowledge part. The tools and technology can be proprietary or whatever, non-proprietary or open source, whereas the data is usually owned by whoever the owners of the data is, either the institution or the patients themselves. So what are your thoughts on that, like having that defined line drawn out very brightly to actually facilitate your information blocking
Yeah.
proposal?
I hate to disappoint, I'm not sure there is a bright line. I think, the reality is that, and this has been true throughout computing, that the nature of the knowledge and the nature of the tools sort of have a blend to it. There are very, very complex property ownership issues in data, right? Like, for example, your electronic medical record, who owns that, has a complex legal construct to it. Things that are sort of, I think, simply published are easier, but some of these deeper things, there are all kinds of folks who are claiming and lobbying for property rights there. So that is a ongoing issue, and it's sort of the flip side maybe, or it's sort of part and parcel of the secondary use of data issue, right? So who owns that data? So there's not a simple answer there.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Please join me in
Thanks. Thanks.